Welcome to Qt Widgets and More. In today's episode, I'll tell you about some troubles I had migrating an in-house tool that I've been working on from Qt 5 to Qt 6, more noticeably in the area of Q variants. Qt Widgets and More is not a YouTube tutorial channel. Sorry about that. I am just giving you a bit of insight into some of the problems I had, plus discussing those problems, hopefully to give you some more insights into Qt 6. So where did it all start? Well, it started with the second episode of Qt Widgets and More ever to be produced, namely the episode on how do you set up your combo boxes from C++, even though the combo boxes were designed in Qt Designer. So let's start with a recap on what that episode was all about. Okay, if that was a bit too fast, let me show you the code from back then. So in that episode, the whole issue was, what do you do when you fill out your combo boxes inside Qt Designer? You make a spelling error in there, and then you fix it. And in the code where you need to access that, how do you do that? And the idea instead was, let's not populate the actual content in Qt Designer, but let's do it in C++ instead. And the code looks something like this. I had this combo box helper class, which took the enum as a parameter, and then it simply populated with the elements in here. And later on, whenever my signals of my slot here do good things was invoked, it was invoked with the enum here, main window, good things. So if I made any spelling errors or I added new enums, I did not access it by index nor by the string that was typed into Qt Designer, but instead through this enum here, and I was done with it. That worked well. What I added, and let me just run this code here. What I added was a reset button, so if I choose angels here and I pressed reset, it would go back to this element here. And how can that be problematic with Qt 5 versus Qt 6? Well, see the reset here, I called another utility method that I didn't show you back then. So it wasn't entirely a mistake back then, but nevertheless, set current value takes this value here and the combo box, and this is the enum again in the data part of my combo box. Set current value is implemented like this. It simply is it's a template again, and it takes the combo box, finds this value in the combo box, and well, set the current index. It worked well, you saw that, right? So let's just go here and change the run settings to be Qt 6 now for combo box setup bad. Let's see what happens. Well, it compiles. It's compiling. There we are. I change it to Depeche mode and press reset, and bam! And that is the most disturbing kind of migration errors. That's when everything compiles, you don't change any code, and then it crashes in the new version. And I'm not bashing Qt 6 here. It is always difficult to make a version change as dramatic as Qt 6 was. I'm just pointing out something to look out for, and this is just one tiny little snippet, but it's more really just to sharpen your senses on what to look out for when you yourself migrate from Qt 5, Qt 4, Qt 3, Qt 2, Qt 1 to Qt 6 one day. Let's debug the code to see what is really going on. So I choose the Qt version I compiled myself, and if you haven't done so, follow this link here, which will show you how to compile Qt yourself. Because when you debug your way into Qt, you must have a debug build of Qt itself, otherwise it's going to jump randomly around inside the file. I set a breakpoint, then on this line here, the crash was in this assert here, so find data must have returned something I didn't exactly expect. So there I am, ready to debug my way in. Let's have a look at the value up here. It's main window : KDAB videos 2. So that's the KDAB videos, the enum from that, which is as expected. Okay, I'll debug my way in. So F11 to get in here. First, it converts it to a Q-variant from the integer value there. Okay, back again. That's just a conversion because I gave it this enum here and I want it as a Q-variant. Let's debug further in. Something here, let's get out of that again. And once again in, and now I'm actually in the find data method. Q_d, well, I'll leave that to another episode to discuss what that's about. Here we look up something in the model, we do something with match, and that is the result that it will be returned here. So that's likely a good place to step into. I step in here, I can see my value coming in, my value here, that's the 2, and a bunch of other things. And I could start stepping down here and explain all the code, but I'll just read it out in my brain here without saying anything, and then I'll figure out where's a good time to stop. Yep, I got that one now. I'm interested in where do I compare the values. And of course, when I did this originally, I read this code thoroughly and I got down to, well, it really is down on this line here where I am looking for that particular value when I run through my element. So I set a breakpoint there. Let's run down there and we can now see that I'm comparing the value and the V is what I got for this particular index. I'll run through all the elements in my combo box, the model behind the combo box, and I now see that I have the value V here. That is angels, and I'm looking for value 2. 0 not being 2, so let's just continue. Now it's Depeche Mode. 1, that's not 2. 2 is 2. Excellent. So now I am, why didn't it say main window : KDAP videos here? It only said 2. Let me just go up here a bit. Over here, up here. So my value was main window : KDAP video. But when I got down here, the data here, now all of a sudden was just 2. See, that's the problem. I was actually making a erroneous conversion from the enum to the Q-variant. I didn't do the Q-variant : from value, which I should have done, which would have kept the type information. I just gave it, as you saw up here, I just gave it that enum down here, so it will implicit convert from this enum, and the only thing it can convert to implicit is an integer. So threw away the information about the enum versus the integer. But why will that crash in Qt 6 and not in Qt 5? Well, let's go to the call here again. I actually did verify, and I'll let that be an exercise for the interested watcher, viewer, whatever, to go and validate that in Qt 5, this comparison here actually says, yep, the number 2 and the enum value 2 are the same. But here you'll see if I do F10, I'll drop out of this test. So no, it was not the same. And that is why if I return from here, you can see that going further down here, is the result empty? Yes, it is. And now I'll return -1. So what is the cure to that? Well, the cure to that is to go back to my call here and make sure that I don't do, that's not the call, it's the combo box level. Make sure that I don't do this conversion. Actually, why is it even a template here? It should just have been a const q variant, and there we are, reference. And now it's a q variant, but I also need to validate the call sites, and the call site, that didn't help me much. Well, I know where it is. It's right over here. Here, I should not make it the implicit version. I should say q variant : from value and specify that. And let's just run it just to validate that it actually works. Running it, and there we are. I'll change it to angels and press reset, and it worked. No crashes. And let's also debug it just to validate that I actually do not lose that type information. Again, press the reset button here. Here we can see the value is main window : KDAP videos. It was before, but it was when I was stepping into this find data. Now you can see that the data here is still main window : KDAP videos. Okay, I admit I didn't follow all that much in the tiny little details on Qt 5 versus Qt 6, I had the impression that migration was more or less a no-op, which clearly it isn't. But there's always situations like this. I'm just trying to tell you to be careful. And the reason why I released this episode in the first place is because I'm running out of material. No, it's because that there's variants all over the place in Qt Widgets and more, because it is somewhat heavy on the models, and I talk about returning your money instance through the models and so on. There was a few more instances that kicked me over when I did the migration. The next one was toString on my variants. So let me show you that. So what you look at here is now a debug of a Q variant. That's the double number 200,000 with this nice C++ 11, 14, 17 separator. I can't remember where it came. And then this Q variant, I ask it to print out as a string. Now the question is, what will it print out? And actually we see the same thing down here with a QString number. That is actually what's going on inside the variant. I did a lot of debugging to figure out why I saw a difference, and it led to this special function here having changed. Again, I'm not bashing anybody, I'm just saying that it can be rather deep down that things has changed that might be difficult to spot exactly when you're using a lot of Q variants. So what do you think it will give? Well, let's try and run it. We'll run it here. Sorry, I meant to do like this. I run it Qt 5, and this one, you can already see, it prints out 200,000. That might have been a pretty good bet for you. But if I run this with Qt 6 now, and same thing here, what you'll see that it now print out 2e plus 0.5. And that's the exponential representation, I believe it's called, with the 2 to the 2 times 10 to the power of 5, or whatever that means. That must be what it means indeed. This version versus this version, and just scale it up a bit for you here. So 200, 200,000, a number of zeros, and 2E05. This one here was Qt 5. This was Qt 6. Does that matter to you? Well, it matters if you actually expect this code to look like this rather than this, which I, for some reason, did deep down in my stack. Just something to be aware of. That, again, I'm pointing out that the subtleties might be deep down in the stack. So how did I spot this? Well, I had the migration of my code, and I had the original Qt 5 code, and I ran something in my Qt 6 version. It didn't work out, so I simply started debugging and doing a parallel debugging to see where did values changed. And eventually I got down to a Q variant that returned different things. I debugged further down, and I got to this one here. And which is the right one? Well, actually, I think it's a bug fix in Qt 6, because this one says use the shortest representation, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is definitely shorter than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So, but still slightly puzzling. Okay, I admit I am smoking a wee bit too much Q variants in my code base, because it's nice to have either a money or a percentage value or something else, and then going from the models to the view, you do not need to worry too much about that. I had one more place where I had a problem with this, because I had some Q variants that came in for a file, and then I was comparing them with operator less than. The code looks like this. Okay, I don't have any code for exactly this, but it looks something like this. Here I have some tests for do this for Qt 5, do this for Qt 6, and just to show you what happens in Qt 6 if I do the Qt 5 way, I now have this if test up here, or true, which means that with Qt 6 compiler, it will also do this code here. And as you can see, it simply complains that the x less than y do not work for 2Q variants. They simply entirely removed that. So the cure to that was to, instead of, well, I needed to do this in Qt 5, and then in Qt 6, what I need to do is to call compare. And compare takes two variants and return a partially ordering, and it can be less let's just go over here and see what it can be. Less, equivalent, greater, or unordered. And unordered, I'll get back to that in a second. But otherwise, and let's just go over here again, you can see it has these less than and equal to, less than equal to, and so on operators, all for partialing, order, and compare against literal zero. So that's a trick that makes it possible to do code like this here. I will go and get the partial, I'll go and get the result here from the compare, and then I can say result less than 0, result greater than 0, result equal to 0. And if it's, I can also compare to unordered. And if it's unordered, then it will print out. So what do I do in here? Well, I have a bunch of variants set up like this, 10, 20, and hello. And I also have some money value here, 100 euro, 30 euro, and 1,000 euro. And now if it's C++, if it's Qt5, then I simply says if x equal to y, then print out if x greater than y, and if they're equal to. It doesn't have the concept of the unordered. For the Qt6 version, I do the same thing here, but after calling compare, and I also compare to whether they are unordered. And now you can see down here, I simply call my test function with 10 and 20 and 20 and 10, and with 10, 10, and with 10 and the string hello, with the string hello and 10, and with amount 1 and amount 2, that is 100 euro and 30 euro, and with amount 1 and amount 3, that's 100 euro and $1,000. Now, how do I compare those? I guess that depends on what day of the year I am comparing it. Let's try and run this in Qt5 first. Qvariant compare. There we are. Running that one, and let me crank up here a bit. So it says here, that's the Qt version printing out here. It says that 10 is less than 20. 20 is greater than 10. Going good so far. 10 is equal to 10. Okay, let's go for beer. It seems to be working fine. 10 is less than hello. Okay. How can you even compare the number 10 and the string hello? Somebody would say that it's like comparing oranges and apples, but I would say it's comparing integers and strings, which I will use in 5 episodes from now, and I hope you laugh when I say that. And then we have 100 euros is less than 30 euros. Okay, that's gonna be some really interesting discussions I'm gonna have with my daughters about money, if that's true. And 100 euros is more than $1,000. Sorry, my American friends, seems like you have some terrible inflations over there that makes 100 euro more than $1,000. And how can that even be? How can it even compare these here? Well, actually, it's not comparing them. It's just going through the meta type system, and it's comparing to their type IDs and some bit representation, which makes no sense whatsoever. What's equally concerning is this hello that is greater than 10, and that's the same story. And that's why we have this unordered facility now. For the money, it can be a bit better. It goes like this. If I just go here and register my comparators in Qt5, so this is a Qt5 thing, register those comparators, and now you can see 100 euro is more than a 30 euro, and 100 euro is more than $1,000. But how can that be now? Well, that is for another episode. But in any case, let's go in and look at the money instance here, and just print out in my operator. So here, printing out that I'm comparing x and y. And x.toString, assume .toString. Do I have it udebug? I did. And now running that again. And you can see I'm comparing a euro 100, and so it is actually using operator less than. And let's just, for the sanity of everything, go over here and make that 0 again, run it again. and you can see there's no printout that I'm actually calling operator less than. So that's what the register comparators in Qt 5 does for us. Let's turn to Qt 6, and there I do not need this register comparators. It is already available, or it does that automatically, and I just need to switch to Qt 6 compare and run it again, and compiling, making the font bigger, and now we can see 10 is less than, and so on. 10 and hello are unordered. So that's where it tells us I cannot possibly compare those. And again, you can see that it is calling my operator less than, and it tells me that 100 euro is greater than 30 euros. And interestingly enough, it also tells me that 100 euros and $1,000 are unordered. And that is true. Which is bigger? It depends on what day of the month or the year you're looking at. It could have been that there was a huge inflation in US and $1,000 was worth 10 euro, or as it is today, where $1,000 is, I don't know, 1,200 euros? I don't know. Sorry about that. I just had to think for just a second while you were waiting for me. In my operator less than, what is happening here is that if the currencies are different, I will say false. So, and if you look at the output, let's just run it again, you can see that it's comparing whether 100 euro is less than $1,000, but it's also comparing whether $1,000 is less than 100 euro. So it's not just doing one, it's doing both. And if I'm saying false to both of them, so 100 euros is not less than $1,000 and $1,000 is not less than 100 euro, then they are unordered, and that's what it's printing out down here. That's it for this episode of Qt Widgets and More. And no, I'm not batching neither Qt 6 nor the migration from Qt 5 to 6. Actually, let me tell you stories of the time when we went from Qt 3 to Qt 4. Those were interesting times. However, just pointing out that just because it compiles doesn't mean that it actually works. And as you saw with that variant toString, really deep down, there might be a small bug fix that nobody realized would actually turn into be a bug in your application. So when you have migrated, test, and test even more. And do keep the old Qt 5 version around for a while so you can compare behavior with that one versus the new one. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And as I said, I might or might not run out of material. So if you have some good ideas for something to look into in Qt Widgets and More, by all means do let me know. Until next time, have a great time.